We are coming to you, live, I guess, from all over the world for our safety and consent in gaming. So welcome to that. If you're here because you're following Misdirected Mark and you're like, hey, they're streaming something, what's this? Stick around because it's bound to be interesting. I'm your host, Danielle Lauzon, and I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Jax. Okay, hold on. Can you hear me? Well, you guys. I have it set. What? Hold on. No. It is. Why are you not pulling in my desktop audio? Hold on. Damn it. OBS, why are you like this? I keep re-choosing it. Okay, I'm gonna try something different. No. Desktop audio, headphones, Soundcore Liberty Neo. No. Apply. Ah. Now we're good. Now we're good.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna start
Can
over.
you hear me?
Jack,
Can I
start
stop
again.
saying self-care for set in sign language? If you're wondering, it's take care of holy snake.
I like it.
So you learned some sign language today. That's exciting.
All right. I appreciate you.
Thank you. So, as I was saying before self-care for set, hi. I'm Jacqueline Bryk, otherwise known as Jax. My pronouns are she, her. I've been freelance writing for the lovely folks at Onyx Path, as well as the folks at Helmgast AB and Ulysses Spele and a couple of other companies for the past 4 years. I wrote the safety and consent sections for Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, Changeling the Lost 2nd edition, the Nefandi Book of the Fallen for Mage 20th anniversary edition. I also wrote a zine called Playing Kindly, which gets into sort of the theory of safety and consent and how we use it as a language. And I also want to give a shout out to our 4th panelist who couldn't be here, Kiana Shaw, who last night, along with Lauren Bryant Monk, won the Golden Ennie for Best Free Product for the TTRPG Safety Tabletop Kit. So we just want to give her a little round of applause right now.
Yay!
Yay, Kiana! We miss you, but congratulations.
Yes, big congratulations.
Yeah. Super congrats.
All right, let's move on to Steffie.
Hi, I'm Steffie de Vaan. I'm a tabletop developer and author, and I write a lot of GM sections, which involves the session 1, session 0, and milder safety rules. And I'm currently working on a consent-based horror game. I previously published We Die Here, which is a small indie game of about 30 pages, and I'm currently trying to flesh that into a full book, and it's going to be like a consent-driven horror game. So that's exciting.
Excellent.
That sounds super exciting.
Yes. All right, and Corinne?
Hi, I'm Corinne. I'm known as Manic Pixie Girl on Twitter. My pronouns are she, her. I am a streamer and showrunner for Onyx Path. I run Scarred Lands, Purge of the Serpent Holds, as well as I do other GMing, DMing things and, like write custom campaigns and stuff like that. But beyond that, I'm just really into safety and consent, and I'm here to contribute thoughts on how you do that as a DM or a GM.
Excellent. And also, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Danielle Lauzon. I am a writer and developer for freelance. I do work for Onyx Path Publishing, Green Ronin, sometimes for Third Eye Games, sometimes for anybody who will hire me. Hire me.
Yes.
Anyway, I also really enjoy safety and consent mechanics because I really like being able to push my players as a GM. I really like being able to push my players in fun and interesting ways. And we'll talk about that as we talk about this, of how you can get the most out of your game and make it as scary and horrible as possible without actually hurting anybody. So let's get right into that. When we the name of this is Safety and Consent in Gaming, which is what we put on Gen Con. But really, the biggest place where we're going to talk about that is in horror gaming. When you're doing things like your cult game or your World of Darkness game or, any of your games that are intended for horror, the safety mechanics are going to be really important. But safety mechanics are great for any game. It doesn't matter what game you're playing. Having some safety tools at the table will help everybody feel really comfortable, and it will make your game better, I promise. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is safety? What do we mean by that? So my panelists.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you wanted to
No.
Yeah, we didn't know if you were going to throw in first. We didn't want to cut
no.
you off.
No, I'm good. Tell me, what is safety?
Jax, you want to go first?
Yes. So something that because I do several of these panels a year, something I think I've come to realize is that safety is more of a constructed language that we have at the table. It's this idea that we are allowed to jump in, to interrupt the status quo, to break the magic of the moment and say, hey, this thing is making me uncomfortable. Can we, pull back on it? Or, hey, I really like this one thing you're doing. Can we do more of that? Mm-hmm. And it's safety to me is sort of that freedom to be able to say both yes and also no at the table without people looking at you weird.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. To me, safety. Yeah, exactly what Jack says. Safety to me is that your character is in terrible straits and well and truly fucked, and all sorts of terrible things are happening to them. But you, as a player, feel safe to explore that because you know that your table mates and your GM have got your back. That if at any point you would say cut, that they would stop. No questions asked, they would stop. And that is safety to me, that you can explore those dark themes and feel safe because you know that the people at the table have got you.
Yeah. And, I agree with all of that. Safety is knowing that you are able to have a good time and like that bad things can happen to your character that aren't happening to you, that you can take a step back if anything is getting too real, that you can say, no, I don't want that to happen to my character, or I'm okay with this happening to my character because I know it's not happening to me. And in this moment, I am consenting to that happening. Yeah. And I feel that having your players have that power makes the game better for everybody because you can go farther, you can do stranger things, you can do weirder things, while everybody's still actually having a good time and enjoying themselves and not putting themselves in a place where they're going to leave and be like, I don't want to come back to this.
Right.
So. Yeah. And actually safety for me is also building on that is the aftercare, that you know that because sometimes in the heat of the moment, it does happen that you think, oh, this is good, I'm going to explore this. And then the game ends and you come down and you're like, oh, wait, I've got feelings and they're weird. And safety is also knowing that there will be someone in the group who you can turn to at that point, and you can go like, oh, I need to talk about this, or could I message you later to talk about this? Could we debrief about this? And that is also safety, the knowledge that if you accidentally push yourself too far, because that does sometimes happen, that you cannot that there's going to be someone who's going to help you work through that.
Excellent. So, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit while you were giving this answer of what is safety, but when we talk about safety, whose safety are we talking about?
Everyone's.
Right.
Yes.
Everyone, GM included. You need to be safe
exactly.
too.
You sure do.
Exactly. Yeah, because Jax and I have been going at it from a player perspective, but yes, we also want the GM to, be able to go, players, I don't like what you're doing right now. Could you please stop killing the goblins? You're making me very uncomfortable. Or whatever the GM wants to do. Yeah, and also the knowledge as a GM that you can push your players and they feel comfortable enough to go, stop.
Right.
Yeah. And it's important to note, I think a lot of tables forget this, is that the GM is also a player. Because you're not paying the GM, the GM is not under contract to do this for you. The GM is doing it because they enjoy it.
Yes.
And GMs are allowed to feel safe too.
Yeah, and even the paid GMs, like if you're getting paid to GM, I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
And even just the fact that somebody's paying you doesn't mean that you can't go, hold on, this is not part of what I signed up for.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whenever you're playing a game or running a game, you've basically made a contract with your players.
It's a social contract.
Yes, it is a social contract. And if that social contract is not being met for anybody, then it basically becomes null and void. So it's important to make sure that everybody is still on board, basically, even if that is the GM or the DM.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm going to ask some things that, we kind of touch on, but I want, more explicit things of, we've talked about what safety is, and we've kind of hinted at why is safety important? What makes it so important? Jax, you look like you want to say something.
Big question. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to answer it, because why is safety important to me is kind of like asking, why do we want to be nice to our friends? Because we care.
Yeah.
For me, go ahead, Jax. Sorry.
Because it's okay, because we recognize as humans that other humans at our table bring their own baggage and their own emotions, and sometimes we need to be able to be like, oh, okay, this particular baggage is not going to work for other people at the table, or we need to stop doing something because there is this baggage at the table, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important for the same reason OSHA standards are important, and it's important for the same reason therapy is important. It's important for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. I would also venture to say that it's more important. It is important for stranger groups. So if you're at a convention, if you're at a game store and you play in a pickup game with people you've never met before, being able to set boundaries with people you've never met is really important. And some people don't know how to set those boundaries easily because they're shy, or they're they just want to be liked. And so having consent mechanics can help set those boundaries when you would otherwise be a little shy about it. But I think that's doubly important in a friend group, because lots of times when you're friends with somebody, everybody just thinks that everybody's going to be okay with whatever's going to happen because we're all friends, right? But being able to set boundaries with friends is actually much harder than setting boundaries with strangers. So I think, thinking about, yes, it is important because we care about each other, but it's also important to have these, absolutely line in the sand boundaries for friends. So we could say you're my friend, but when you talk about X thing, it really bothers me. And instead of calling you out hey, friend, quit being a jerk, instead I could say well, we have these boundaries already set, and we have protocol for just how to handle it without people getting their feelings hurt. So I think that's a thing to think about too, is, I hear a lot of people saying, in pushback to safety mechanics, oh, well, my friends have never had problems with my games, or my friends and I are always the ones playing games together, and I never have issues. And the answer isn't always that you're going to have issues. It's that your friends won't tell you because of the social dynamics involved in friend groups. So.
Yeah. And I have a story about that. Something happened in my group recently. So this is a group that I've been playing with for years. We know each other out of the game. We know each other so well. We're friends. And then I got into that mistake that GMs sometimes make, that you go, I know these people. Mm-hmm. I don't need to go over consent. I know these people. So what happened was, to me, all races are the same, like goblins, orcs, humans. None of them are monster races. Like, all of them are just people.
Right.
And the group that I had did have a tendency to deal with threats in a resolute manner when it was goblins and orcs. Not that they were needlessly aggressive, like they would absolutely pursue diplomatic solutions, but if it came to this goblin group is going to be a problem down the road, they would be like, okay, we need to fix this. Mm-hmm. And because to me, they're all people, I went in when they were faced with a human cult who was going to be troubled. I went in assuming that they were going to do the same. And so some of the players did indeed approach it that way. They were like, we can't redeem these people. They are truly heinous. We just need to cut this off, like, deal with it. And one of the players came forward and he said, to me, there is a difference between the humans and the goblins, because if I picture goblins, I picture fictional creatures, and if I picture humans, I picture humans. And I know that I have occasionally been the one that went, we need to kill this goblin king and deal with this, but we can't do this with the humans. We need to find a different way. And I'm very glad that he was able to, and we had the whole discussion about that, because at first I didn't get it. I was like, but you did this with the goblin king. And then as we talked, we came to the conclusion, oh, wait, this was a disconnect, that to me, these groups were all the same. To him, they weren't. I'm very glad that he felt comfortable enough to say that. But if I had discussed safety and consent beforehand, we wouldn't have had this. Like, right. That is just because I went in blind, because I thought, I know these people, right. We've been playing for years, it's going to be fine, and it wasn't fine. And thankfully, he spoke up, and then we were like, okay, let's find a different way. And I retconned a couple of things, and I introduced ways to redeem them and such. So it turned out fine. But yeah, that was a big, oh, wait, and I care heavily about consent. But this one I didn't even spot it until one of the players went like, stop.
Right. And that's such a good point that we'll get to later about the difference between like setting these boundaries early and then also being able to react to things in the middle of stuff, right? So, when you talked about consent and stuff like that, let's talk about what consent is. So we talked about safety and why we need safety mechanics. So let's talk about what consent is in general. So, we all know what the word consent means. So let's talk about the kinds of consent that you can give. So I first want to talk about informed consent, which is what you were talking about, Steffi. If you had talked about it beforehand and people had known what was going on. So explain informed consent to our listeners.
I just hogged the airtime for 5 minutes, so I'm gonna let Corinne and Jax go.
Yes. So informed consent is when you have discussed something beforehand with your players, or with your DM or GM, so that they can agree, disagree, or like give stipulations on the thing that's going to happen. It is telling your players where this is going, what's going to happen, or what's going to be in a game in general, so that they can say, yes, I'm cool with that. No, I'm not cool with that. Or I am okay with that, but these things can't happen, or it has to be done this way. Or it's basically informed consent is when you're setting the boundaries and the rules beforehand, so that in the moment you've already set those rules. It is making sure that you know what the rules and boundaries are before you go into it. Whereas there's other types of consent which aren't directly as direct, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, informed consent is as simple as saying, here is what I want to engage in the game. And if you're not telling them, like, as what happened in a very famous case this year, where somebody was like, I'm going to give you upgrades, and then wound up installing an orgasm jack on somebody's character. That was not discussed, and the player thought that they were getting faulty upgrades, not rapey upgrades, and that was not informed consent.
Right.
Because part of the ability to consent was withheld for the element of surprise, which is something we're going to talk about probably a little later. But
yeah,
I have a whole thing on suspense and surprise and shock and whatnot. But
right.
you can have informed consent while also having story beats, and that's really important because a lot of people think that, oh, well, if I tell my players everything that's going to happen, then nothing's going to frighten them, and that's not actually how human psychology works.
Yep.
So
I have a story about that, which I'll go ahead and tell because we were talking about informed consent. So I played a video game recently, like literally just like yesterday or the day before. It's very short, and it's called let me make sure I have the name correctly. Okay, so it's called The Suicide of Rachel Foster. Okay, so right in the name of the game is suicide. So there's some informed consent here that I am going to be playing a game that is a story about suicide. And it absolutely was. But not in the way that the title, like it was not specifically this suicide of this one person. It was, it dealt with suicide. It dealt with a lot of heavy concepts, but it was, I was informed, hey, this is going to be about suicide. And it absolutely was, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't just like, we're going to talk about this one person's suicide. That's not what it was. And so there were reveals, there were, story beats, there were things that were, on the tin, this is the story that it's about. And I have very strong feelings about like surprise and then now there's suicide happening, because it says it's a very triggering thing for me. So, I was like, cool, I know what I'm getting into, but I was still able to have these things where like, oh man, I wasn't expecting that. Like, so you can say like, hey, this session is going to involve these things and not tell people necessarily where they're going to show up or how they're going to show up. And still have story beats and still have the ability to tell people a story that is interesting and maybe even a little surprising to them, but giving them the ability to know this is one of the things that's going to come up is XYZ, whatever it happens to be. So, so we talked about informed consent. Let's talk about implicit consent or implied consent.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so implied consent is that there are certain aspects to the genre, and if we're going to play that genre, it's implied. If you play a vampire game, you do have implied consent that there will be feeding, probably on people, because that is a staple of a vampire game. Whether that should be implied or explicit, that's the second thing, but that would be an implied consent thing. You sign up for a vampire game, so you live at night, you don't see the sun, and you feed on people, and you're immortal while the people around you die. That's kind of what you sign up for if you sign up for a vampire game, and that would be implied consent to me.
Yep.
And yeah, whether that should be implied or whether you should focus on whether you should highlight that for your players, that's the second part of the discussion. But
right,
yeah, I actually have kind of an interesting story about implied consent. I was running a LARP at a convention, and the LARP was listed as being like a fun, sort of heartwarming game about spirits and witches and people in a small town, and was listed as all ages. And I had some adult players come in, and once they realized they were in a room full of kids, loudly announced that they do not play with children. These kids were like between the ages of 12 and 16, and left. And I was very upset by it because the description specifically said, all ages welcome, this is a game where you might play with children. And then they realized only halfway through the game introduction that there were children in the room. And I wasn't so much angry at them for leaving because of kids, right? But they left loudly
Yeah.
because of kids. And like, I am glad that they set their own boundaries and decided to bounce, but there was someone else later in the game who's like, hey, you know, I feel like I'm parenting these kids and I parent kids at home, so I'm going to dip out, but like, I'm going to let the kids know that, hey, my character is going home to bake a pie.
Yeah.
And that was a much safer and kinder way of realizing, oh, there was implied consent for this, and I am no longer comfortable with this.
Yes.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, I will say that I sometimes think that implied consent can be, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, like Steffi, with your example from your game group earlier, where you think you know people and you have had, you know, I know that this person is not, you know, arachnophobic, and so I'm going to throw a big spider at them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an implicit consent that I can throw a big spider at them because I know that nobody here is arachnophobic. But that doesn't mean that halfway through a spider fight, somebody's not going to be like, oh man, this is giving me the heebie jeebies. Like, I don't like it anymore. So, you know, you have to be careful with implied consent,
Yeah.
and try to make it explicit when possible. I think a lot of human interactions involve implied consent, without even thinking about it. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of, you know, we're having a conversation and somebody starts to speak, and then you kind of step back and they're not like, can I speak now? Yes, you can. Like, there's a lot of implied consent in human interaction, and because of that, we tend to forget that certain interactions really want explicit consent, because
Mhm.
that's how we stop and not just hurting each other, because we talk about hurting each other, and that is a thing that happens, but even just lost expectations, right? Like, broken expectations can be a form of hurt that is, you know, it's not necessarily damaging, but it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So we talk about that. So let's talk about consent, at the different stages of a game. And I call this consent before, during, and after. So let's talk about how to get consent at these different stages.
So what we're seeing a lot now is consent forms that the GMs will send out before a game, and they've got this list of. There's one that was the one that drew such big attention, like before COVID. Everything that is
BC.
Before COVID.
Exactly. What was it again? From a big gaming company, Monte Cook's
Yes.
consent in gaming, and we've been seeing more of that. And the pages get longer, so people include more. So then there's like the violence, gore, societal topics, and you've got pages, and you can fill it all out. And those are very popular right now, and I think those do work in a generalized way, but there's also, because I filled one in recently, and a lot of topics, you can go green if you want a lot of it, yellow if it needs to be discussed, and red if it's no. And a lot of them for me were like blood and gore, like they don't do anything for me, but I also don't mind. So none of the above. It's not green because I'm not like, yes, I want blood and gore. It's also not yellow because I'm fine if you include it. It's more like I have no particular opinion on that, which puts me in an odd category, because then I'm checking them as green, but they're not really. So the consent forms, I think, are a good start, but maybe we're relying on them too heavily at the moment. Like, they should be the start and not the end point of getting your informed consent at the start. But I think it is a good jump-off point to have people fill in how they feel about certain topics, and especially the red ones, because I do have some red ones, and I really value that I can tick those off and no, don't do that. But yeah, there's also not that I don't care, and then there's also the category of not me, but I'm fine if it happens to somebody else.
Right.
And I would say that, like, the safety, like the consent checklist, is a really good way to start when you first start talking about the game. Like the thing that the GM or the DM or whoever's running the game should do is lay out what the themes of the game are, so that the players can choose right out of the gate, are those themes that I'm comfortable with, or is there something that here isn't for me? And then once you've done that, then consent checklist, especially if you've never played this game before, you don't know these people. But I'd say it's good across the board regardless. So then have people fill that out. But that's not the end. After you have everybody fill that out, the DM or GM needs to look through that, see what's in there, and hopefully have a discussion with the players to say, okay, what does this mean for you? You know, so that in the case of Steffi, it's like you get that chance to discuss what this very black and white checklist actually means in a game, because a game isn't black and white.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and I think, you know, when I talk about consent before, during, and after, you know, there's definitely have this checklist, have this ingredient list. You know, I, as a GM, you know, I want to run a game, you know, it doesn't matter what it is, say Bluebeard's Bride. You know, there's some very explicit things that could happen in a game of Bluebeard's Bride. And so I should probably write out a checklist of things that I would like to include in this game, I would like to explore, so that my players know, you know, what kind of personal feminine horror we're going to be dealing with, because there's just so much of it. And so I'm going to put this out there, but then I'm also going to include a checklist of like, okay, this is what I'd like to explore. And within those confines, what would you be, you know, how much of it do you want to see? You know, should I talk to you before we do this? Or is there any of things, because, you know, when I say like, yeah, I want to explore like, you know, the abandonment and, you know, desolation and loneliness in my game of Bluebeard's Bride. And somebody says, okay, yeah, like that sounds all great. But when we start digging into what does that mean? Like, I can't deal with loss of children stories. Right. And I go, okay, yeah, that's fair. Well, we won't include things like that. So, you know, the consent isn't just a form that your players are filling out. It is a conversation. And so I think that's a thing. And it's not just a conversation at the beginning of the game. It's a conversation in the middle of the game, and it's a conversation at the end of the game. You know, something that we haven't talked about yet, which I'm going to now ask you all to expand upon, is the concept of debriefing. And what is that?
So something I love about debriefing is that we already sort of have a vague understanding of it in gaming culture. And that is the war story, right? Where you go to a diner or you get some snacks and you hang out like, wow, wasn't it really cool when I did X, Y, and Z? And it's sort of a way of, you know, for war stories, it's sort of a way of like going back over the game, releasing tension, and debriefing just really builds on that. Like, you can tell war stories during debriefing. That's great. And I think there's this tendency to go, oh, don't tell war stories when you're debriefing, because then that really gets in the way of the debrief. And I don't think that's necessarily correct, because I think telling war stories is a great way to sort of connect with the character from a distance. But the idea of debriefing is sort of like to process any emotions you felt during the game, to sit with them, to sort of realize where they're coming from, and then deal with them as you see fit, right? Like, and sometimes a debrief won't end with everybody leaving the table smiling. Sometimes it's like, hey, I realize I need to go home and lay down.
Yeah.
Or, you know, hey, I need to take a break from thinking about this game. That's not a failed debrief, right? Like, the idea is with a debrief to figure out where you are so that you can figure out where to go from there.
Yep. You know, I'm going to let Steffi or Corinne, if you have anything to add to that.
Steffi, you go first if you have an addition.
No, I largely agree with what Jack said. Yeah, it's what I referred to way earlier, that the sense of safety, that if you do push yourself too far or you get caught up in the story and you need to wind down, that you know that you can talk to people about that, and that the GM is going to listen to you when you say that, and they're not going to brush you off, because that does occasionally happen in the wrong kind of groups.
Right.
That they're like you signed up for this. Well, maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't see this one coming.
Right.
But yeah, that's part of consent, is that you do have the ability to go in later and go, we need to talk about this.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of an anecdotal story, but it is, an example of debrief, that a debrief doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be, dogs. No, you're fine. Debrief doesn't have to be a formal structured event, right? It can just be a conversation between you and your friends about how the game went. And I think it's very important, to the point where, like, my husband and I debrief after board games. Because, especially if it's like an intense game of like diplomacy or something like that, where we will, we have intense feelings while we're engaged with games of any kind. And so afterwards, recognizing the emotions that you feel, talking about them, even just naming them, is really affirming and helps you recognize, I had an emotion, or I had an emotional response to something that happened, and now that I've talked about it, it's gone. Or maybe it's not gone, but I understand it better. Or now I'm able to let it go, instead of seething about why you lost that dumb game of Ticket to Ride, or whatever. You'd be like, it's because I kept getting blocked and like I couldn't finish my tickets. And now that I've expressed that anger in a safe way, I can let it go. And it's good for small dumb games that don't matter. And when you're used to doing it for dumb games that don't matter, it becomes so much easier to talk about how you felt in big, heavy games that, also don't matter, but feel like they matter more because it was so intense. I used to play Dystopia Rising a lot, and every weekend, you're there, you go in Friday night and you don't leave until Sunday morning. And so every night when we would, go down to lay, to go to sleep, again, I would have these like, what did you do at game tonight? And we would talk about our experiences before we went to sleep. And just having that moment of talking about our experiences helped to release those experiences and prepare us for the next day. And so you don't realize how important it is to discuss the game that you played or the experience that you had, and how like affirming it is to have somebody either recognize that it's like that your emotions are valid, or just express those emotions in a way that feels affirming. So I just want to say that like we all do it already anyway, like Jack said, war stories, but making sure you do it and doing it and making it a habit makes it so much easier for it, like things that are really heavy. Corinne.
So I do have just a quick anecdote about a time where debrief would have been really useful. And it was before like I started running things. I didn't really have any idea about consent or anything in gaming. And so this was back when I first started playing Pathfinder. And we were playing Pathfinder. We were pirates. It was Skull and Shackles. So, it has some like wild stuff in it because you're pirates. You're not good people. But there was a specific situation where the strongest fighter in our group got mind controlled. And that mind control was to kill our captain. And so the strongest fighter in the group was trying to kill the captain. The rest of us were trying to stop him from doing that. 2 characters died. Woo. And then at the the end, he used darkness to disappear, and like we couldn't find him to fight him. And by the time we left that fight, 2 of us were dead. He was God knows where, like stealing our ship and traveling away. And it was like 2 a.m, and we all left so angry and upset. Like we got to the end and we were just so mad at each other, at the situation. We knew it wasn't his fault. Like, James didn't choose to do this. He wasn't like, I'm going to kill the captain and half the party. But it was what was happening due to the aboleth that was in the deep, dark ocean. And if we had taken the time to, after we finished that session, to just talk about it, no matter how tired we were, to just sit there and discuss it, that it wasn't personal, that he wasn't trying to murder us, we would have left that game feeling so much better. Yeah. Whereas the next week, it was hard to come back for all of us. We left and we were angry. Like, both my husband and I were in that game, and like, we couldn't even speak to each other because like his character had died, mine was on the brink of death, and we're like, how do we come back? And if we had just taken the time to talk about it, I think we all would have felt so much better.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Jax.
It's so something I want to talk about real quick before we move on is I'm hearing a lot of like, oh, this is how you let emotions go. This is how you get rid of emotions you don't want. And something that I've learned through like 7 years of therapy with trauma is that sometimes it's not about letting the emotion go so much as integrating it. So it's not like taking over everything else, but instead it has like a place in your body and mind. So I think debrief in a lot of ways, like, like obviously, Corinne, you were super angry after that game. And I think that anger served a purpose because you were feeling helpless and like frustrated. And I think it's less about sort of letting that anger go and more about integrating it into yourself. So like next time when you're in a situation like that, you can sort of go, hey, this is not the sort of play I signed up for. Right. You begin to sort of integrate it in to realize what these warning signals are and what they're trying to tell me.
Right. Yeah, and I said letting go, but you're absolutely right. It's really coming to terms with them and accepting them for what they are, and then I say letting go, but it's really just kind of integrating and moving past them and recognizing them. So
I mean, like, sometimes you are, and to be fair, sometimes you are letting those emotions go. Sometimes you are just saying like, hey, I felt this in the moment because of this, and now I don't have to feel it anymore. And that is also valid. But I think there is a place for bringing it in and also letting it go.
Right. So, yeah. Excellent. All right. Now, big, heavy topics. So let's talk, we have a few minutes left. So let's talk about horror in specific, even though this isn't specifically a horror in safety panel, but I think horror is the best place for this. And it's, I want to talk about, I guess, calibration is probably the best word for it when you're doing something like horror or a game that you're going to be dealing with big, heavy topics of how do you calibrate during the game or, whatever, to make sure that we're doing the thing we want to do, which is scaring our players or putting our characters in dangerous situations, but making sure everybody's safe during that. So let's talk about that.
So I think during the game, especially during horror, so you have your content warning and you've discussed everything and everybody knows that it's going to be a game about alien spiders who turn into sewer clowns who kill people. So once you've established that and everyone's on board, then I still think it's important to constantly check in with each other, like just watch each other's body language, use an X card, things like that, in case it does throw you for a loop. But what I like about once you have that consent, you can go in really hard. And as a player, what I have found, for example, we talked about Bluebeard's Bride briefly. A lot of topics that are a hard no for me in a lot of games, I am fine exploring in Bluebeard's Bride, because you're going to explore it going in, but also it's central to the game. It's not you're running a game of Vampire and then all sorts of misogynistic things happen. Like, no, that is not why I play Vampire. But I do consent to it in Bluebeard's Bride, which then means that we can go explore that. Mm-hmm. And so I think for horror, because you do when I watch horror, I do want to be afraid. I want to be able to hit pause, but I do want to be afraid. Otherwise, I wouldn't watch more horror movie. I would watch the Eurovision movie, which is the best movie of the year.
Oh, it was so good.
I'm so glad you liked
I
it.
know.
It was so fun.
Yeah, and for the US audience, as someone from Europe and a Eurovision fan, I can tell you that yes, this is exactly what the actual content is like. That's it. Basically a documentary. But what I like about horror is that you can get scared. And in horror games, I want to be kind of terrified, but I want to do it in a way that I signed up for it. I want to do it in a way that makes me feel safe. I want to do it in a group that makes me feel safe. And that's why consent is so important, because once you've sorted all that out, you can then go in really hard in the game and know that everyone's fine with it. Like I said, you do want to check in. But that's why I think consent in horror especially is so important. Though my other game with the goblins, where I accidentally had people set them up in a situation where murder was the best option, and that one player didn't like it. That was actually a fantasy game. I do think that sometimes we overlook it in fantasy games because this isn't scary, but people still have boundaries.
Yeah.
But yeah, for horror it works because once you've sorted it out and you know that everyone feels safe, you can go
Right.
with your murder pseudo clowns.
Yes. Yeah.
Something Kiana talks about, and she's not here right now, and I wanted to chat a little bit about her since she won an Emmy, and that was very exciting.
Yes. For this
is something she mentioned is that we don't write safety rules to dampen people's creativity. I think the example she gave was if I know, for example, that you don't want to see, I don't know, sexual horror, talking about Bluebeard's Bride, because that was something we were talking a lot about, because it does involve a lot of sort of topics that are taboo in a lot of other games, because the game is specifically written to handle these topics that are very difficult to handle in other games. And that's unfortunately another part of safety that we don't really have a lot of time to discuss, is how you design your game intrinsically for that. But if you don't want pregnancy horror, but you want body horror that doesn't have to do with pregnancy, I know that I can't lean into the pregnancy horror, but I can lean real hard into the body horror.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't just tell me, oh no, you can't do this. It tells me, yes, do more of this.
Right.
And that is, as a horror GM and a horror writer, that is one of the most incredible gifts you can give me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah. Some of the things about like what Steffi was saying is that, there are some topics that like are, like I said, like suicide is one of those things that if every consent form everywhere, I mark that as a red for me. Like, I just don't want to deal with players talking about, like, I don't want to deal with the discourse around it. I don't want to, have to deal with it in a game. But then I went and played a video game that literally had it in its title. And it's because I had control. I have full control over a video game. I could stop at any moment. It's never going to question why I stopped it. I could just, turn it off, throw it out the window. It doesn't matter. I have full control there. And so I will engage with a thing that normally I would shy away from because I have so much control over it. And so, when you have really good safety mechanics, you may find people who are like, normally I wouldn't touch, pregnancy horror with a 10-foot pole. But all of these safety mechanics are built in a way that I'm willing to explore it in this one situation. And I know that it's safe. And I know that I can confront it in a safe way. And so I think it's also really good in that way too, where people will explore things that normally they'd be like, nah, I don't trust that.
Yeah.
Where they'd be like, oh, but I can trust that because I am in full control of when I can, when it will end, when it won't, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And before we move on real fast,
yes.
I know we don't have too much time left. I did just want to say that I think the important thing to remember with horror gaming is that you want to traumatize characters, not players.
Yep.
And being able to approach all these really scary things in a way that's safe for your players makes it so you can approach them harder. giving your players an out, even if it is during the game, during whatever's happening, whether it's using an X card, a safe word, or whether it is having check-in partners, it means that you can go harder, as everyone else has said, and make that game even better for everyone. Yes. But at the end of the day, you don't want to traumatize your player. Just for the factor.
Yeah. You want to scare them, but you don't want to traumatize them. Right. And I actually had that. I was listening to a true crime podcast a while back, and they were talking about a murder that I would not be okay with normally. Like, that would be in a game, that would be one of my red topics. But this was a pretty good podcast, so I was listening, and it was fine. And I had to pause because I needed to do something. I don't remember what. And it turned out the podcast had frozen, and I couldn't pause it. Oh. Bam! I was fine, and boom! I wasn't fine. I wasn't fine because I couldn't turn it off. I couldn't. I didn't have control, and that made so much difference. Like, I ended up just rebooting my entire phone in a near panic because I'd lost control. And the moment I realized that I couldn't control whether I wanted to listen to this, it was not okay anymore.
Right.
But so and that goes for everything. Like, I do not want to be stalked and murdered, but if that is the topic of the game and I consent to that and I go in talking about that with people that I trust, I would be fine. But if you wanted to run a game of Vampire and my character is stalked, like, no, right. That is not fine. Right. Because one boom, So that made a huge difference. Just that visceral reaction that I had the moment that I realized that I didn't have control over this podcast anymore. Right. That was the moment I lost my consent.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I'm just going to say this really quickly, and then we're going to get to questions. There's a couple of questions from the chat that we should be able to get in time. But I think one of the things that we talk about consent and safety and all this stuff is really important to think about is player agency. Characters can lose agency all day long. In fact, a lot of horror is loss of agency. That is a thing, either it's because you've been kidnapped or you've been attacked or you've been, whatever, stalked, all this stuff. Those are all loss of control and loss of agency. Your players should never lose agency. You should never design any encounter ability or anything to steal agency from your player. They should always feel like they are in control of their character, even if their character is not in control of themselves.
Especially if.
Yes. So I think that's, all of the other stuff, like, I don't want to deal with this stuff. As long as people feel like they can be in control of how these things are happening, I think that's your key to making things safe. All right. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to save the first question for last because it's a thing. So I'm going to ask, how do you handle safety and consent in a convention setting? What's the best way to do that? Jax.
Honestly, use the safety mechanic that you are most comfortable with. Because unfortunately, we cannot tell you one size will fit all. And a lot of times people will just be like, oh, here's the tabletop RPG safety toolkit. It's on my table. That means we're safe. Pick one or two safety mechanics that you know well, that you are comfortable using, and that you feel you can explain to people at the table in 10 minutes or less.
Yes.
Yeah. I would also say content warnings or just content descriptions. Like, anything that you have the slightest doubt about if people might want to encounter this in a game, just put it in your content. This game features body horror, gore, and ants. Just put it in there, and then people who don't like those things know that they should not sign up for your game.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, especially at conventions where it's not a pickup game, but it's a scheduled event. Most conventions give you plenty of space for your description. And so, you want to put your elevator pitch of like why this is exciting, make that like a sentence, and then, include that, like, this is a game about child endangerment. Like, some people are really excited about that. Some people will not come to your game, but put that on the label. And then when you get there, also talk about how you can do safety mechanics, even if it's, child endangerment is elves stole my baby in my fantasy game. Like, make sure that that's explicit, but it have safety mechanics available.
Yeah.
But again, the once you're most familiar with. So the next question is, how do you handle playing with a group where the GM and some players are outside of the consent culture? So these people don't really understand what this stuff is. And then they wind up doing something that makes you uncomfortable. So, Jax.
Understand that you don't have to play with those people. I'm gonna be honest with you here. Like, it is not your responsibility to teach people these things. If they're willing to learn and they're open to learn and they're people that you can talk to and be like, hey, this thing you did made me really uncomfortable, then great. But if they're the sort of people who are like, if you say, hey, this thing you did made me really uncomfortable, they go, what? It's just a game, bruh. It's just a game, bruh. What's up? Like, maybe consider finding a different group.
Yeah. If they care about you, then they care enough to learn for you. Yeah. And if they don't, then I'm not saying they're bad people, but I am saying that you and that group do not mesh well.
Yeah. And I want to say normalize standing up and walking away. That's harder at like a friend group. So, I understand that like if you're at somebody's house and they're like, well, it's just a game. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to get in my car and leave now. Like that's a little harder. There's a little more peer pressure there, but like specifically at like conventions, man, normalize, like somebody just said something really shitty and you were like, hey, that was not great. And they're like, yeah, I don't care. Just get up and walk away. Normalize that stuff, because once people realize that the consequence of their actions is that either they're booted from the table because your GM is good enough, they will stop doing that eventually. Like if every time I open my dumb mouth and say something dumb and I get kicked out of tables, either I'll stop or I'll stop going to those conventions. Either way, it's a win for everyone else.
Yeah. But if you did stay at the table, don't feel bad. I think every woman and every queer person I know has a story of, I wish I'd gotten up and left. Not 90% of them has one of those stories where they go, I wish I just had the guts to go up and leave. So if you didn't, that's not on you, that's on them. But you have our permission now. Next time you feel uncomfortable, just get up and leave. Just go, this is not for me.
Yep.
If I may first, I was just going to say, one thing that is something that I've really been taking to heart lately is where your own safety and well-being is concerned, fuck politeness. Mm-hmm. You don't need to appease other people when your own safety and your own well-being is in danger or being taken away from you.
Yep.
You can get up from that table. You can say no. It matters more that you're okay than what people are going to think of you in that one moment.
Yeah.
Because you're the one who has to live with the way you feel. They don't.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And also, there might be more people at the table hoping that somebody's going to stand up and walk away.
Exactly.
Yeah. We are almost out of time, and so I'm just gonna. There was one more question, and it was super simple, so we'll end on it. Which is, what are your go-to tools for safety at the table? Jax.
So I really love the OK check-in, which is something that was actually designed for LARP, but I feel it works really well for tabletop games too, because it is not just incumbent on the person who is not okay to say that they're not okay, but it also allows other people at the table to have an active role in determining whether or not someone's okay, which is hold an OK sign over your heart. You don't hold it upside down because terrible people do this.
Yes.
But the answers are yes, I am doing okay. I'm not sure. No. Anything other than a yes, I'm okay should be treated as a, hey, let's pause the game and figure out what we can do.
Yeah.
So.
Steffi?
I like the X card because it is a very small physical motion that you can make. And I sometimes think that when you're faced with a bad situation, you freeze up. But putting my hand on a card and pushing it forward is something that most people can probably still do. So I like the simplicity of it, that it's such a small thing. You don't have to speak. You don't have to make anything major. It's a very small motion, which I think probably helps. But I'm probably going to use the OK check-in from Jax because I like that one too a lot. And content labels. I'm all about just tell people. Like I made that mistake with my fantasy game, but just tell people like, oh, where you. If I just told them way earlier, like the label is you cannot save these people, and now you've got to deal with it, then they would have known.
And I would say that, yeah, I mean, basically the two that are my favorite have already been mentioned, content warnings and the X card. Content warnings because you give like that idea of what you're getting into straight out of the gate so people can get out of there if that is not the game they want. And that's so important. And then the X card for in the moment because you never know what's going to sneak up on you. You never know what's going to bother you right then, even if you're okay with it before. So I think those two are going to be my favorites because they kind of cover two bases, if not all of them.
Right. Yeah. And for me personally, I really like OK Check-In. Again, I come from a LARP background. I do a lot of tabletop and LARP, but people have designed an OK Check-In system. I think it's called the safety flower or the consent flower. I'm not sure which.
Yep,
but it's
safety flower.
Safety flower, where it's like in the center is red, and then there's some petals on the outside that are yellow, and then some further out petals that are green, and you can kind of point to a color. Depending on the situation. So without, doing whatever hand symbols, essentially you can say like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm touching green. I want more of that while it's happening. Or just be like, oh no, red, whatever. So it's a little more nuanced than just an X card. Or, you could do yellow. I like this, but maybe slow down or just make this a little like less. So it's a little more nuanced than an X card. It does have a lot more. It can be daunting. So using hand symbols, another thing that I like to do is, just as a GM or as a player is to keep an eye on body language and check in with people verbally. Like, hey, you're making some tense faces. Are you okay? And just stopping and asking somebody that sometimes relieves a bunch of tension. And we'll open them up to saying something that maybe they would have reached for that X card, but they were too frozen to do it.
Yep.
So, keeping that in mind of that, like we can have all these safety mechanics and stuff, but you still got to be cognizant of the people around the table in the moment may not use any of them. So that's it though. We could probably talk for another hour on this, but we are out of time. Thank everybody for coming. Thank you to my panelists for sitting and talking with us. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Gen Con.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, have fun and have safe gaming.
All right, bye.
Safe
everybody.
gaming, yes.
Safe gaming. Bye.
Wash your hands.
Wash your hands.